A quiet veteran Navy SEAL moved into a mountain town with only his German shepherd beside him. People laughed when he built strange wooden walls around his cabin before winter arrived. But his dog kept staring into the northern forest, like he sensed something coming. Then the storm hit early, and the entire valley disappeared beneath snow and darkness. Power failed, cabins froze, and the only safe place left was the structure everyone mocked. What nobody knew was that this veteran had already survived one deadly winter war before. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join Veteran Dog Stories tonight. The first thing Cade Whitmore noticed about Pine Hollow Bend was the silence, not the peaceful kind tourists drove north to photograph every autumn. Not the soft hush of pine trees or the distant cry of loons drifting over silver water. This silence felt older, sharper, like the mountains were listening instead of sleeping. His old pickup rolled slowly along the narrow dirt road that curved around the lake, tires crunching over frozen gravel. Pale morning sunlight spilled through the tall northern pines, painting streaks of gold across the windshield. Frost still clung to the edges of the road, even though autumn had not fully surrendered to winter yet. And beside him, Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat. The German Shepherd K9 was 5 years old, broad-chested and lean with the compact muscular build of a working military dog. His black and tan coat looked darker under the cold mountain light. Thick around the shoulders and neck, a black tactical nylon collar rested against his fur. The silver tag stamped with one simple word: Ranger. The dog's ears twitched constantly, not nervous, listening. Cade rested one hand on the steering wheel and glanced sideways at him. "You feel it too, huh?" Ranger did not look at him. His deep brown eyes remained fixed on the forest ahead. Cade understood that look. Danger did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly, one wrong gust of wind at a time. The cabin appeared at the edge of the ridge 20 minutes later. It stood alone above the lake beneath a line of towering pines, weathered by decades of snow and mountain wind. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and the porch rails leaned enough to make most people nervous. But the place still had strength in it. Cade could see that immediately, just like old soldiers. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching over thin frost. The cold air hit him hard enough to sting his lungs. And Cade Whitmore stood 6'1", with the heavy shoulders and controlled posture of a man shaped by military discipline long ago. His olive field jacket hung open over a dark red and blue plaid shirt, the fabric faded with age. Dark cargo pants disappeared into worn brown leather boots scratched by years of rough terrain. His jaw was sharp beneath rough stubble, and early silver had already claimed the hair near his temples. Some men carried war in scars. Cade carried it in the way he watched horizons. Ranger jumped from the truck and immediately began circling the clearing. The dog sniffed the frozen ground once, then froze. His ears rose. His body stiffened. Slowly, Ranger turned toward the northern ridge. The forest beyond the trees looked perfectly still beneath the pale sky, yet something deep inside the dog had shifted. Cade watched carefully. "You hear something?" Ranger did not bark. He simply stared. That unsettled Cade more. Far above them, a flock of birds crossed the lake unusually low, wings beating fast against the wind. Too low. Cade narrowed his eyes. Then he saw deer tracks near the shoreline, fresh ones, heading downhill. His stomach tightened slightly. The last time he had seen wildlife move early like that. He pushed the memory away before it fully formed. The cabin door groaned open with effort. Dust drifted through weak sunlight pouring across the old wooden floorboards. The place smelled like cedar, cold stone, and forgotten winters. Ranger entered first, always first. The dog moved room to room silently, inspecting corners, windows, shadows. Only when he returned to Cade's side did Cade finally relax enough to exhale. "Guess we're home." The word sounded strange in his own voice. Home. He had not used that word seriously in years. By midday, Cade was unloading supplies from the truck when he noticed another vehicle approaching along the ridge road. An old green Ford pickup slowed near the property line. The driver was a tall elderly man with a heavy brown canvas coat and a gray beard thick enough to hide most of his face. Deep wrinkles cut across his weathered skin like dried riverbeds. Walter Boone looked like the mountains themselves had carved him from old wood and cold wind. Walter leaned one arm out the window. "You the Whitmore boy?" Cade nodded once. Walter studied him for a moment longer than most people would. Then his eyes drifted toward Ranger. "That dog's military." "Yeah." Walter nodded slowly, as though that explained something important. Ranger stepped closer to Cade's leg, posture calm but alert. Walter noticed. "So," the old man said quietly, "you planning to stay through winter?" Cade looked toward the frozen shimmer spreading slowly across the edge of the lake. "That's the plan." Walter's expression changed slightly. Not fear, recognition. He climbed out of the truck slowly, boots pressing into frost. Up close, he smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine sap. "The mountain gets quiet before heavy storms," Walter murmured. "Most folks don't notice anymore." Cade looked at him carefully. "You do?" Walter gave a dry chuckle. "Survived the white winter of '83. Lost half the livestock up here. Nearly lost my brother, too." Ranger suddenly turned toward the northern trees again. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Walter stopped speaking. The old hunter followed the dog's gaze toward the forest line, where the wind had suddenly died completely. No branches moving, no birds, nothing. Walter's face darkened slightly. Then he said the words that stayed with Cade the rest of the day. "Mountains don't stay this still unless they're waiting." Before Cade could answer, Walter climbed back into his truck and drove away slowly, tires crunching over frozen gravel until the sound disappeared into the trees. For several seconds, neither Cade nor Ranger moved. Then Ranger finally relaxed, only slightly. By late afternoon, Pine Hollow Bend had already started talking about the new man on the ridge. Cade noticed the stares when he drove into town for fuel and groceries. People glanced at the old military truck, the scarred man behind the wheel, the German shepherd sitting upright like a soldier. At the general store, conversation softened when he walked inside. A teenage cashier with freckles and nervous eyes nearly dropped a carton of milk when Ranger entered beside him. "He friendly?" she asked carefully. "Friendlier than me." The joke came out dry enough that even Cade almost smiled. Almost. Outside the store, a woman stood arranging mailbags near the post office entrance. Mara Ellison looked to be in her early 30s, slim and tall with auburn hair tied loosely beneath a knitted gray cap. Her forest green coat reached almost to her knees, and cold mountain air had painted her cheeks pink. There was something observant about her face, not judgmental like the others, curious. She watched Ranger first, then Cade. "He's beautiful," she said softly. Ranger approached halfway before stopping, studying her. Mara crouched slightly but did not try touching him immediately, smart enough to wait. "He's deciding if you're trustworthy," Cade said. "And am I?" One corner of Cade's mouth moved faintly. "Still alive, aren't you?" That finally earned a real smile from her. For the first time all day, the knot inside Cade's chest loosened a little. But only a little. Because even standing in town beneath warm sunlight, he could still feel the cold moving through the valley like something alive. That evening, just before sunset, Ranger suddenly bolted upright on the cabin porch. Not barking. Frozen. The dog stared across the lake toward the northern ridge. Cade followed his gaze, At first he saw nothing except pine trees darkening beneath the falling light. Then, movement. A line of birds exploded upward from the forest all at once. Hundreds of them. Not migrating, fleeing. Ranger released a low sound deep in his throat, and for one brief moment, Cade felt the exact same cold he had felt years ago on a mountain halfway across the world. Minutes before men started dying in the snow. Night came quickly after that. The temperature dropped hard enough to freeze the edge of the porch railing white. Inside the cabin, Cade lit a lantern and unpacked the final crate from the truck. The old black notebook rested inside. He stared at it for several seconds before opening it carefully. Page after page filled the worn leather-bound journal. Structural sketches, snow load calculations, ventilation designs, emergency heating layouts, whiteout rescue paths, elevated dry wood systems. Every drawing carried tiny handwritten notes in the margins. Some lines were so deeply pressed into the paper they nearly tore through, and Ranger lay near the front window watching outside while Cade flipped slowly through the pages. Then he reached the sketch he hated most. A collapsed shelter frame. Snow pressing through broken beams. Small black X marks beside names. Eli, Turner, Mills. Cade's jaw tightened. For a moment he could hear the wind from that night again, hear men coughing in frozen darkness. Hear someone saying, "Wood's too wet. It won't light." Ranger stood immediately. The dog crossed the room silently and pressed against Cade's knee, grounding him, pulling him back. Cade placed one rough hand against the dog's neck and breathed slowly until the shaking in his fingers stopped. Outside, wind whispered through the pines. But Ranger still would not leave the window. He remained there staring toward the north ridge long after the lantern burned low. Long after the lake disappeared beneath darkness. Long after the rest of the valley fell asleep. Before finally extinguishing the lantern, Cade looked once toward Ranger and quietly whispered, "Last time I wasn't ready." The dog's ears twitched. Cade looked toward the frozen darkness outside the cabin windows. This time will be different. And somewhere far beyond the trees, hidden deep in the silent northern mountains, Winter listened. The sound of hammering carried across Pine Hollow Bend before sunrise. Sharp, steady, unforgiving. Cade Whitmore worked the same way he breathed. Controlled, measured, wasting nothing. Frost coated the ground around the cabin, while pale mountain light slowly filtered through the pines. The northern ridge behind the property stood dark beneath a low ceiling of gray clouds, though the forecast had promised clear skies for another week. Ranger sat near the edge of the clearing, watching the trees. Not resting. Watching. The German shepherd's muscular frame looked tense beneath his thick black and tan coat. And every few minutes, one ear twitched toward the mountain, while his eyes tracked movements invisible to Cade. Cade drove another steel anchor into frozen dirt. The structure around the cabin had already begun taking shape. Long support beams connected elevated wood racks beneath angled roofing panels, designed to force heavy snow downward instead of allowing buildup. Narrow airflow gaps sat beneath each section to keep moisture from trapping inside the wood stacks. Thick rope lines stretched between support posts so someone could navigate the property during complete whiteout conditions without getting lost 10 feet from the door. To most people, it probably looked insane. To Cade, it looked unfinished. He stepped back, studying the frame carefully while cold air curled through the trees. His rough hands flexed unconsciously around the hammer handle, old scar tissue tightening across his knuckles. Still not enough support on the north side. Not if the wind hit hard. He grabbed another beam. Ranger suddenly stood. The dog's gaze locked toward the ridge again. Cade followed the direction automatically, but saw only pine trees swaying beneath weak morning light. "You hear something?" Ranger did not move. Then slowly, reluctantly, he sat back down. Cade hated that. The dog trusted his instincts more than any human ever could, and when Ranger hesitated, it usually meant something beyond ordinary danger. By late morning, the first spectators arrived. Two teenage boys on bicycles stopped near the property line, staring openly at the expanding structure. One wore a thick red hunting jacket 3 sizes too big for him, while the other had shaggy blonde hair sticking from beneath a baseball cap despite the cold. "What even is that thing?" the blonde kid whispered. The other laughed. "Looks like some survival bunker." Ranger lifted his head immediately. The boys froze. Not because the dog growled, because he didn't. The complete silence from a military K-9 was somehow worse. Cade continued working without looking at them. "Oh, morning." The teenagers exchanged awkward glances before one finally asked, "You really think winter's going to be that bad?" Cade secured another bolt before answering. "I think mountains don't care what forecasts say." The boys did not know how to respond to that. They rode away a minute later, though Cade heard one mutter, "Whitmore Fortress." The nickname spread through town before noon. Around midday, Sheriff Owen Pike arrived. His county SUV rolled slowly up the ridge road before stopping beside Cade's truck. Owen Pike climbed out, adjusting the collar of his heavy brown sheriff's coat against the wind. And he was a broad man in his early 50s, with thick silver hair, tired blue eyes, and the permanent stiffness of someone carrying old knee injuries. Years earlier, Owen had survived a highway pileup during an ice storm while pulling strangers from wrecked vehicles. Since then, he trusted systems, radios, forecasts, and procedure more than instinct. It was the only way he knew to keep people alive. He studied the structure carefully. "That's a lot of lumber for one cabin." Cade wiped frost from his gloves. "Needed doing." Owen stepped closer to one of the elevated racks. "Folks in town are getting curious." "Curious isn't illegal." "No," Owen admitted. "But building, whatever this is, makes people nervous." Ranger moved beside Cade silently. The sheriff noticed immediately. The dog stood perfectly still, but his eyes never left Owen's face. "Well trained," Owen said carefully. "He was trained to keep people alive." Something about the answer unsettled the sheriff. He glanced back toward the growing framework. "You expecting a blizzard nobody else knows about?" Cade looked toward the clouds gathering over the northern ridge. "The geese left 3 weeks early." Owen frowned slightly. The lake edge froze overnight. Still silence. "And last night," Cade continued quietly, "the wind shifted north before sunset instead of after." Owen exhaled slowly through his nose. "That doesn't mean catastrophe." "No," Cade replied. "But it means something changed." For a moment, the only sound was the creaking wood frame around them. Then Owen said, "Look, I know you served. People around here respect that. But Pine Hollow isn't some combat zone." Cade's jaw tightened faintly. "No," he said. "Well, combat zones are usually louder." The sheriff left soon after, though he kept glancing back at the structure while driving away. Ranger watched the SUV disappear until the sound faded completely. Only then did he relax. Slightly. That afternoon, Mara Ellison arrived carrying 2 paper coffee cups. She walked carefully through the frost-covered clearing, boots crunching softly over frozen grass. Her auburn hair escaped beneath a dark wool cap in loose curls stirred by the wind. Up close, Cade noticed faint freckles across her pale cheeks and tiredness beneath her green eyes, the kind that came from years of taking care of other people before herself. "You've officially become the town mystery," she said, offering him a cup. Cade accepted it cautiously. "That bad already?" "One old woman at the grocery store thinks you're building an underground shelter." He almost smiled. "Another guy thinks you're preparing for the apocalypse." "That one's less creative." Mara laughed softly at that. Ranger approached slowly, sniffing the air around her gloves. She crouched naturally without trying to force affection onto him. "Still deciding if I'm dangerous?" "He usually knows before I do." The dog studied her another second. then quietly sat beside her boot. Mara blinked in surprise. Guess I passed. Cade noticed it too. Ranger trusted almost nobody quickly. That mattered. Mara looked up at the structure again. You planned all this yourself? Cade nodded once. You an engineer before the military? No. Then how do you know this works? For a moment, silence settled between them. Then Cade answered carefully. Because I once built one that failed. The warmth vanished from his expression so quickly, Mara immediately regretted asking. But before she could apologize, Ranger suddenly sprang upright, every muscle locked. The dog stared toward the trees near the frozen lakeshore. Cade turned instantly. The woods looked empty, yet Ranger began moving slowly toward them, step by step, silent, focused. Mara whispered, What's wrong? Cade didn't answer. Ranger reached the tree line and stopped beside a patch of disturbed snow beneath the pines. Then the dog lowered his head, sniffed once, twice, and slowly backed away. Cade approached carefully. Buried beneath thin frost lay the body of a young deer. Dead. No wounds, no blood. Its body was stiff with cold. Mara's face paled. That's impossible. Cade crouched beside it grimly. The deer had frozen overnight, in autumn. That night, long after Mara left, Cade woke suddenly to the sound of Ranger growling low beside the bed. Not barking, warning. The cabin was dark except for weak moonlight spilling through the windows. Ranger stood completely rigid facing the north wall. Then, a single heavy thud echoed somewhere deep in the mountains. Not thunder, not a gunshot. Something larger, something collapsing. Ranger's ears flattened instantly, and for one terrifying second, Cade thought he heard distant voices beneath the wind. Sleep never returned after that. Cade spent the rest of the night reinforcing the northern supports beneath lantern light, while Ranger patrolled endlessly around the property. By dawn, exhaustion burned beneath Cade's eyes, but the structure had changed again. Stronger, heavier, more deliberate. The warm ring, as Noah Bell had secretly started calling it in town, now wrapped almost halfway around the cabin. Additional support braces reinforced the windward side. Elevated firewood racks stood beneath angled roofing panels. Thick rope lines connected every section together. Anyone looking carefully would realize something unsettling. This structure was not designed merely to survive winter. It was designed to survive disaster. Near sunrise, Noah Bell appeared again carrying a small paper bag. The 10-year-old boy wore a green puffer jacket too thin for mountain cold and boots caked with frozen mud. His dark hair stuck wildly beneath a knitted cap, and nervous curiosity constantly flickered across his face. I brought jerky, he said awkwardly, for Ranger. The dog approached slowly, sniffed the bag, then gently accepted the treat from Noah's hand. The boy smiled immediately. Mom says dogs know things before people do. She's right, Cade said quietly. Noah looked toward the northern mountains. Do you think something bad's coming? Cade stared at the unfinished structure around the cabin, at the frozen deer beneath the tarp near the trees, at Ranger standing motionless once again beneath the pale northern sky. Then he answered honestly, I think the mountain's trying to warn us. Noah swallowed hard. The wind shifted, cold enough now to hurt, and somewhere beyond the silent ridge, winter kept moving closer. By the third morning, Pine Hollow Bend no longer felt like a town preparing for winter. It felt like a town unknowingly standing on the edge of something alive. The air had changed first. Not colder exactly. Wrong. Cade Whitmore noticed it the moment he stepped outside the cabin before dawn. The wind carried no scent from the lake anymore. No pine resin, no damp earth. Only dry cold rolling down from the northern ridge in thin, invisible streams that slipped beneath clothing and settled deep in the bones. Ranger was already awake. The German shepherd stood near the unfinished northern side of the warm ring, staring toward the mountains with the stillness of a hunting wolf. Frost clung lightly to the black fur along his shoulders, while pale breath drifted from his muzzle in slow clouds. Cade watched him carefully. "You haven't relaxed in 3 days." Ranger's ears twitched once. Then the dog slowly walked toward the edge of the property and stopped beside the rope line facing the forest. Waiting. Cade hated waiting. He picked up another beam and continued reinforcing the support braces around the elevated firewood racks. The repetitive work helped quiet his mind. Measure, cut, bolt, repeat. Simple things made sense. Nature did not. By mid-morning, the first bad news arrived from town. A fisherman named Russell Green had nearly fallen through lake ice near the eastern dock. People kept repeating the same sentence. But the lake shouldn't be freezing yet. Cade heard it twice while loading timber into his wheelbarrow. Then again from Mara Ellison when she arrived carrying mail and concern in equal measure. "You heard about Russell?" Cade nodded. Mara stood near the half-finished structure studying the dark clouds gathering beyond the ridge. She wore a thick charcoal sweater beneath her green coat today, though the calendar still claimed autumn. Loose auburn strands escaped from beneath her wool cap, blowing across pale freckled cheeks already reddened by cold wind. He said the ice cracked like glass beneath him, she said quietly. One second it looked normal. Next second the whole edge gave way. "Water's cooling too fast." Mara folded her arms against the wind. "Walter thinks the mountain's changing." Walter's probably right. She looked at him carefully after that. "You really believe something bad's coming?" It wasn't a question. Cade adjusted another support beam before answering. "I think people ignore danger when it arrives quietly." Mara's eyes drifted toward Ranger. The dog remained fixed on the forest, still watching. "He hasn't stopped doing that since I got here," she whispered. "No." "Why?" Cade stared toward the ridge himself. "Because he remembers?" Mara frowned slightly, but did not press further. Some wounds announced themselves loudly. Others lived silently inside routines. By afternoon, strange stories spread through Pine Hollow Bend, faster than weather reports. 3 hunting dogs refused to enter the northern woods during a deer tracking trip. A barn roof collapsed beneath a layer of ice even though snowfall hadn't started. Power flickered twice near the southern road despite clear electrical lines. At Miller's Diner, people laughed nervously while talking about it. Too loudly. Like people trying to convince themselves fear was ridiculous. Cade sat alone in the far booth drinking black coffee, while Ranger rested beneath the table beside his boots. The diner smelled like bacon grease, wood smoke, and old coffee. Warm compared to the sharp cold outside, but tension still moved quietly through the room. Earl Maddox stood near the counter telling anyone who would listen that Cade's fortress was probably causing bad luck. Guy moves here 2 weeks ago, and suddenly the whole mountain act's cursed. A few people chuckled. Others didn't. Walter Boone sat near the window wrapped in his heavy brown coat, weathered hands around a steaming mug. The old hunter's gray beard looked rougher today, and dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he had not slept much. Finally, Walter spoke without turning around. "The mountain don't care enough about us to curse anybody." Silence spread briefly through the diner. Earl scoffed. "Then what's your explanation?" Walter looked slowly toward the window, where weak afternoon light reflected across frozen streets. "I've heard this kind of quiet before." Nobody laughed after that. Sheriff Owen Pike entered a few minutes later, carrying snow reports in one hand. His broad shoulders filled the diner doorway while cold wind followed him inside. "Everybody calm down," he announced. "Forecast says light system next week. Nothing major." Walter muttered into his coffee. "They said that in '83, too." Owen sighed heavily. "Walter, every cold front isn't the end of the world." "No," the old hunter replied softly. But every deadly one starts with people saying exactly that. The sheriff noticed Cade watching silently from the corner booth. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Owen crossed the diner toward him. "You're getting people worked up." Cade leaned back slightly. "By building wood racks? By acting like disaster's guaranteed." Cade's expression remained calm, but something colder moved behind his eyes now. "You know what kills people fastest in storms?" Owen folded his arms. "Fear." "No," Cade said quietly. "Normalcy." The sheriff frowned. Cade continued. "People freeze because they keep believing tomorrow will behave like yesterday." The diner had gone completely silent again. Even Earl stopped talking. Under the table, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. Every muscle in the dog's body tightened. Cade noticed instantly. So did Walter. Ranger slowly stood, then turned toward the diner windows. Outside, snowflakes had begun falling. Tiny, sparse, but impossible. It was still October. That evening, Noah Bell knocked softly on Cade's cabin door just before dark. The 10-year-old boy stood bundled in an oversized blue winter coat, cheeks red from cold. In his mitten-covered hands, he held a folded piece of paper. "I made something," he said nervously. Cade unfolded it beneath lantern light. It was a child's drawing of the warm ring around the cabin. But that wasn't what made Cade go still. In the drawing, Noah had added something else. Far beyond the trees behind the cabin, hidden near the northern ridge, the child had drawn enormous pale shapes standing in the snow, watching. Cade looked up slowly. "What are those?" Noah shrugged uneasily. "I don't know." Then the boy whispered, "Ranger keeps staring at them." The snow stopped after only 15 minutes. But the temperature continued dropping, fast, too fast. By nightfall, thin frost coated the inside corners of Cade's cabin windows. Ranger refused food for the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow Bend. Instead, the dog paced from window to window restlessly, before finally settling near the northern wall again. Watching. Always watching. Cade sat at the kitchen table with his old black notebook open beneath lantern light. He flipped slowly through pages filled with survival calculations and military shelter designs until he reached older entries written years earlier overseas. His jaw tightened immediately. The handwriting changed there. Less controlled, more desperate. Outside the cabin, wind scraped softly through frozen pine needles. Then came the memory. A different mountain. Canvas snapping violently in freezing darkness. Men shouting through whiteout conditions. Someone screaming for dry wood. Eli Mercer kneeling beside collapsed support beams with blood freezing across his gloves. "The snow load's too heavy." Cade shut the notebook hard enough to rattle the table. Ranger crossed the room immediately. The dog pressed against Cade's leg until his breathing slowed again. "You always know when it's happening," Cade murmured. Ranger rested his head briefly against Cade's knee, then suddenly lifted it. The dog's ears rose sharply. Outside? Nothing. No wind. No branches moving. No owls. The silence returned again, but this time it felt different. Not empty. Listening. Cade slowly stood and stepped onto the porch. The night air cut across his face like ice water. The entire northern ridge had disappeared behind thick gray haze, moving low between the trees. Not fog exactly. Something colder. The lake below looked black beneath moonlight. Then Cade noticed movement near the shoreline. 3 deer, all standing perfectly still, facing north. Ranger stepped beside him without making a sound. Neither moved. Neither blinked. And for one long, terrible moment, the whole mountain seemed to hold its breath with them. Cade whispered quietly into the frozen dark. "It's coming sooner than anyone's ready for." Ranger did not look away from the ridge. And because somewhere beyond those trees, hidden inside the silent northern wilderness, something had already begun changing. The storm arrived at 2:13 in the afternoon. Not gradually, not politely. One moment Pine Hollow Bend sat beneath a heavy gray sky with weak snow drifting lazily across the valley. The next, the mountain exploded into white. Wind slammed against Cade Whitmore's cabin hard enough to shake the walls. Snow blasted sideways through the trees like handfuls of shattered glass. Visibility disappeared almost instantly beyond 30 feet. Ranger was already on his feet before the first real gust hit. The German Shepherd barked sharply once, racing toward the north side of the warm ring, while Cade shoved open the cabin door against the pressure of the wind. Cold air hit him like a physical blow. Damn! The temperature had dropped too fast. Far too fast. Snow swirled violently through the elevated support beams surrounding the cabin, yet the structure held exactly as designed. The steep roofing angles forced snow to slide downward before heavy accumulation could form. The protected wood storage remained dry beneath layered ventilation slats. Thick guide ropes stretched visibly between support posts despite the growing whiteout. The warm ring worked. Perfectly. And that terrified Cade more than failure would have, because he had only built systems like this once before. And the last time, men died anyway. A loud crack echoed somewhere down the ridge, then another. Cade looked toward the valley below, but the town had vanished behind sheets of white snow. Roads were already gone. Power lines swayed violently overhead before disappearing into the storm. Behind him, Ranger growled low in his throat. Not at the storm, at the sound hidden inside it. By late afternoon, Pine Hollow Bend had completely disappeared beneath the blizzard. Electricity failed first. One sharp flicker. Darkness. Then came the silence afterward. The unnatural silence that always followed modern systems dying all at once. No refrigerators humming. No distant traffic. No town lights. Only wind. And Cade moved quickly through the cabin lighting lanterns and reinforcing interior heat barriers. His motions became automatic beneath pressure. Muscle memory from years spent surviving places colder and crueler than most people could imagine. Ranger stayed close. Too close. The dog kept pacing toward the front door before returning again, unable to settle. Outside, the world had become pure white chaos. Snow hammered the cabin roof endlessly. Trees bent under violent gusts. Somewhere farther down the ridge came another deep, collapsing sound. A woodshed. Maybe more. Cade checked the wood storage beneath the warm ring again. Dry. Completely dry. Meanwhile, across town, most families would already be discovering the truth. Wet wood did not save lives. A sudden pounding rattled the cabin door. Cade opened it cautiously. Walter Boone stumbled inside, wrapped in snow and wind. The old hunter looked 20 years older than he had that morning. Ice crusted through his beard and eyebrows, while his heavy coat hung stiff with frozen sleet. "You were right," Walter breathed heavily. Cade shut the door immediately behind him. "What happened?" Whole lower road vanished under drift lines. Walter coughed hard into his glove. Maddox's shed collapsed. Half the town lost wood storage already. Ranger moved around Walter anxiously, sniffing the cold air blowing in through cracks around the door. Walter looked toward the warm ring outside the frosted windows. "That thing of yours may be the only reason this ridge survives the night." Cade didn't answer. Because surviving the first night was exactly how the last disaster had started. An hour later, Sheriff Owen Pike radioed through weak emergency frequencies. Static crackled violently between broken fragments of speech. "All roads blocked. Station generator failed. People sheltering at church and school." Then silence again. Cade stared at the radio grimly. Walter sat near the stove, rubbing warmth slowly back into his hands. The old man's weathered face looked hollow beneath lantern light now. "I've never seen it come this early," he whispered. Neither had Cade, and that was the problem. Ranger suddenly froze beside the door. His ears rose sharply. Then came the sound, faint, almost swallowed by wind. A child screaming. Cade's blood went cold instantly. Ranger barked hard and sprinted toward the door. Cade grabbed his coat automatically. Then the wind outside howled. And suddenly he wasn't inside the cabin anymore. Canvas ripping apart in darkness. Men shouting through snow, frozen fingers fumbling wet matches that would not light. A shelter beam collapsing beneath white weight. Eli Mercer screaming somewhere beyond the storm. "Cade! Cade!" Snow buried everything. Faces disappeared. Breathing stopped. Cade's lungs locked violently. His hands began shaking. The cabin walls vanished beneath memory, until all he could hear was wind and dying voices swallowed inside whiteout conditions exactly like this one. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And Ranger did something no battlefield training manual could ever teach. The dog didn't run toward the screaming child. He came back. Ranger leapt against Cade's chest, barking directly into his face. Hard, sharp, furious. Then he grabbed the front of Cade's field jacket with his teeth and pulled, again and again, dragging him backward into the present. Back into the cabin. Back into now. Cade gasped violently as air finally returned to his lungs. Ranger pressed against him fiercely, refusing to stop until Cade focused on him completely. Blue-gray eyes met dark brown ones, steady, anchored, alive. Then Ranger barked once toward the storm again. The child was still out there. Cade grabbed the rescue rope. This time his hand still shook while tying it around his waist. Walter stepped forward immediately. "You can't go alone." "Yes, I can. You collapse out there, and nobody finds either of you." The old hunter was right. Cade hated that. Walter secured the secondary line around the warm ring support beam, while Ranger circled impatiently near the door. "Who's missing?" Cade asked. Walter swallowed hard. "Ellie Maddox." Cade closed his eyes briefly. Earl Maddox's daughter, 10 years old. Small for her age, with thick brown curls and oversized winter jackets handed down from cousins. Cade remembered seeing her once outside the general store trying unsuccessfully to pet Ranger while pretending not to be afraid of him. "She went looking for dry wood," Walter whispered. Guilt hit Cade instantly, because of course she had. Most of the town's wood was already ruined. Cade opened the cabin door. The storm roared like an animal. Snow blinded him immediately, even with goggles pulled tight across his face. A wind slammed hard enough to stagger him sideways before Ranger lunged forward into the whiteout. "Easy!" The dog ignored him. Ranger moved low and fast through drifts already reaching knee-height. The rescue rope stretched behind Cade as he followed through nearly invisible terrain. Nothing existed anymore beyond. Rope, snow, breath, dog. The world had narrowed to survival. "Ellie!" The wind swallowed his voice whole. Ranger suddenly changed direction sharply downhill. Cade followed blindly. Then he heard it. Crying. Weak now. Buried beneath wind. Ranger barked wildly and disappeared behind a collapsed woodshed, half swallowed by snowdrifts. Cade rounded the wreckage and saw her. Ellie Maddox curled against the broken wood pile, barely conscious beneath layers of snow. Her small gloves were soaked through completely. Ice covered her eyelashes. "Oh God." Cade dropped instantly beside her. "Ellie? Hey. Stay awake." The little girl shivered violently. I got lost." Ranger pressed against her immediately, sharing body heat while Cade wrapped her inside his heavy field jacket. "You're okay now," Cade said firmly. Not true yet, but necessary. He lifted her carefully into his arms, and the storm hit harder. Wind exploded across the ridge with terrifying force. Snow erased every landmark instantly. For one horrifying second, Cade lost sight of the rescue rope. The panic surged again. Afghanistan flashed violently across his mind. Bodies disappearing into white, voices fading forever. No. Ranger barked sharply from somewhere ahead. Once, twice. The dog had found the line. Cade forced air into his lungs and followed the sound. Step, step, step. Ellie trembled weakly against his chest, while Ranger kept circling back repeatedly through the storm to guide them. Without the dog, Cade knew they would already be dead. Finally, through swirling white chaos, the warm ring emerged ahead like the skeleton of a ship rising from frozen water. Snow slid harmlessly from the angled roofs exactly as designed. Guide ropes still stretched visible between support beams. The system worked. It actually worked. Walter yanked the cabin door open as Cade stumbled inside carrying Ellie. Warm air crashed over them instantly. Earl Maddox stood from beside the stove so violently his chair flipped backward. The big man looked destroyed already. His thick beard was covered in frost, while terror hollowed his normally loud, arrogant face. Gone was the town joker who mocked Cade's fortress. Now he was only a father. Ellie! He rushed forward as Cade lowered the little girl carefully near the stove. She's hypothermic, Cade said quickly, but breathing okay. Earl collapsed beside his daughter, shaking harder than she was. Oh, God. Oh, God. Ellie opened her eyes weakly. Dad? That single word shattered him completely. Earl buried his face against her hair and began sobbing openly. No pride left, no mockery. Only gratitude and terror and relief tangled together. Across the room, Ranger finally lay down heavily beside the stove, exhausted but alert. Cade stared toward the storm outside the frosted windows. The blizzard screamed harder than ever now, and deep inside his chest, something colder than fear settled quietly into place. Because this storm, this was only the beginning. The second wave of the storm arrived just after midnight. The first blizzard had been violent. This one felt merciless. Wind screamed across Pine Hollow Bend with a force strong enough to shake entire cabins off their foundations. Snow no longer drifted through the valley. It attacked it. Thick white sheets swallowed roads, fences, rooftops, and landmarks until the entire mountain became one endless, frozen void. Inside Cade Whitmore's cabin, lantern light flickered weakly against wooden walls while exhausted survivors huddled beneath blankets around the stove. Ellie Maddox slept near the fire, wrapped tightly inside Earl's heavy coat. A Walter Boone sat nearby, sharpening an old hunting knife absent-mindedly. Not because he needed it, but because old men survived fear by keeping their hands busy. Outside, another crash echoed through the storm. Somewhere in town, another roof had collapsed. Cade stood near the window, staring into white nothingness. His olive field jacket was still wet from the rescue. Frost clung to the dark stubble along his jaw, while deep exhaustion hollowed the shadows beneath his blue-gray eyes. Ranger rested beside the stove, but not fully. The German shepherd's ears still twitched constantly despite fatigue. His chest rose slowly beneath thick black and tan fur, while snow melt dried across his paws. And every few seconds his gaze drifted toward Cade, as if checking whether his human partner remained steady. Cade heard the next sound before anyone else. 3 faint knocks against the rescue rope outside. Not random. Intentional. Walter rose immediately. Someone's out there. Cade opened the door into violent wind. Sheriff Owen Pike stumbled through the whiteout, gripping the guide rope with frozen hands. Snow coated his heavy sheriff's coat completely. Behind him came 2 more figures, dragging a wooden sled loaded with blankets and supplies. Owen looked broken now, not physically, emotionally. The certainty he once carried had disappeared somewhere beneath the storm. We've got people freezing across town, he said hoarsely. Generators failed at the church, roofs collapsing faster than we can clear them. Cade stepped aside immediately. Bring them in. One of the men helping Owen was Jacob Mercer, a tall volunteer firefighter in his late 30s with broad shoulders and thick black curls flattened beneath ice-covered knitwear. His face carried the permanent redness of someone accustomed to smoke, winter air, and sleepless emergencies. Jacob had spent years helping Pine Hollow bend through forest fires and flood seasons. But tonight, genuine fear sat behind his brown eyes. "The roads are gone," Jacob said quietly while helping secure the sled inside the warm ring. "We can barely move 10 feet without losing direction." Cade looked toward the support ropes stretched between the beams. "That's why the lines stay anchored." Owen stared at the warm ring around the cabin again. For the first time, there was no skepticism left in his face, only realization. "You built all this expecting something like this to happen?" Cade didn't answer immediately, because the truth sounded too heavy spoken aloud. Finally, he said quietly, "I built it because once before, nobody listened." Silence settled heavily around the room. Then Ranger stood, and the dog limped slightly from exhaustion, but moved straight toward the door again. Alert, listening. Cade's stomach tightened. "What is it?" Ranger barked once sharply, then again. Far beyond the storm, another cry echoed faintly through the wind. "Human." Cade grabbed his coat instantly. Walter cursed softly. "You can't keep doing this all night." "Yes, I can. You'll collapse." "Maybe." Ranger barked harder. The choice was already made. The rescue missions blurred together after that. Hours lost meaning beneath whiteout conditions. Cade and Ranger moved through Pine Hollow Bend like ghosts tied to guide ropes and instinct, and the warm ring became the center of everything. Rescue staging point, dry wood storage, emergency shelter, navigation anchor. Without it, nobody would have survived the night. They found Nora Green first. The elderly widow had become trapped beneath part of her collapsed porch roof after trying to clear snow herself. Cade discovered her because Ranger suddenly dove toward a drift pile near the house and began clawing furiously through snow. Nora was 74, thin as winter branches, with silver hair braided tightly beneath a wool cap. She had lived alone since her husband died from lung disease 15 years earlier. People described her as stubborn because loneliness often disguises itself that way. When Cade lifted the collapsed timber enough for her to crawl free, she grabbed his arm tightly with trembling fingers. "I thought this mountain finally came to take me," she whispered. Ranger pressed against her gently while Cade wrapped her in blankets. "Not tonight," he said. Later, they rescued the Bell brothers. Arthur and Simon Bell were identical twins nearing 80 years old who still lived together in the same cabin they were born in. Years earlier, both men had worked logging camps across northern forests, but age and bad knees had slowly trapped them inside smaller and smaller lives. When Cade reached them, hypothermia had already begun setting in, and their stove had died hours earlier. Wet wood refused to burn. Arthur's lips had turned blue. Simon kept trying unsuccessfully to light frozen matches with shaking hands. Cade forced warm broth between their teeth, while Ranger curled beside them, providing heat until transport arrived. Outside, the storm worsened. Trees snapped constantly now. Cabins groaned beneath snow load. And still, the wind kept rising. Near dawn, Cade and Ranger reached a small cabin near the northern ridge after hearing weak cries through the storm. A massive pine tree had crashed directly through the roof. Inside, a young family huddled beneath an overturned table while snow poured through broken rafters above them. And Cade crawled forward carefully. Then Ranger suddenly exploded into motion. The dog lunged violently toward the back corner of the room. A second later, the entire ceiling collapsed where Cade had been about to step. Wood and ice crashed downward in a deafening roar. For one frozen heartbeat, Cade stared at the wreckage in shock. Ranger stood between him and the collapse, chest heaving, eyes locked onto him with terrifying intensity, as if the dog had known before the mountain moved. They got the family out moments later, but the storm demanded payment eventually. It happened just before sunrise. A little boy named Caleb Turner became trapped beneath a collapsing awning outside the old feed store. The child couldn't have been older than 8, bundled inside an oversized red winter coat while screaming for his mother through the wind. Cade sprinted toward him immediately, too slow. The awning snapped. Ranger saw it first. The German Shepherd launched forward with explosive force and slammed directly into the boy's chest, knocking Caleb clear into the snow just as the wooden structure collapsed. Crack! The sound hit Cade harder than the storm. Ranger cried out sharply. One of the support beams smashed directly into his hind leg before bouncing sideways into the drift. No! Cade dropped beside him instantly. Ranger tried standing, collapsed immediately. The dog's breathing came fast now, pain visible even through his discipline. Snow gathered rapidly across his dark fur, while Caleb sobbed nearby completely unharmed. Cade barely noticed. His hands shook violently while checking Ranger's leg. Not broken completely, but bad. Too bad. For several seconds, the storm disappeared entirely, because suddenly Cade wasn't seeing Ranger. He was seeing Eli Mercer buried beneath snow years ago overseas, seeing another partner collapse while he failed to stop it. The same helplessness crashed into him all at once. Butcher, Jacob Mercer reached them moments later with the rescue sled. Cade, we need to move. Cade couldn't answer. He lifted Ranger carefully into his arms instead. The dog whimpered softly but still tried licking Cade's glove as though comforting him. That nearly broke him completely. Back inside the warm ring cabin, the storm hammered endlessly against reinforced beams, while Cade sat beside Ranger near the stove. Everyone else moved quietly around them. Nobody interrupted. Sheriff Owen secured windows. Walter boiled water. Mara Ellison wrapped medical splints carefully around Ranger's injured leg with hands gentler than Cade expected. Her green eyes glistened with worry, while Ranger endured the pain without aggression. He's unbelievably calm, she whispered. He trusts us, Cade answered quietly, but his voice sounded hollow. And for the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow Bend, Cade wanted to stop. Not because he feared death, because he feared loss. He sat there staring at Ranger for a long time, while wind screamed outside the cabin walls. Finally, Cade whispered, I can't lose you too. Ranger lifted his head slowly. Pain trembled through his body. Yet the dog still tried standing, failed once, then again, then finally rose halfway, despite the injured leg shaking beneath him. Not because he was healed, because Cade needed him standing. The sight hit Cade harder than anything else that night. Ranger still intended to keep fighting, even injured, even exhausted, even afraid. Cade closed his eyes briefly, then nodded once. Okay, partner, he whispered. Outside, the storm roared louder than ever. Inside, something inside Cade Whitmore steadied again. And when he finally stood beside Ranger once more, the longest night on Ashfall Ridge was far from over. Morning never truly arrived. The storm swallowed it. Gray light drifted weakly through the whiteout above Pine Hollow Bend. But the sky remained buried beneath layers of violent snow clouds. Wind hammered the mountain without pause now, turning every exposed surface into frozen stone. Inside Cade Whitmore's cabin, exhaustion hung heavier than smoke. People slept wherever they could, against walls, beneath tables, wrapped in blankets near the stove, shoulder to shoulder inside the warm ring shelter corridors. Children whimpered in uneasy dreams, while old floorboards creaked beneath shifting weight and endless wind. Cade had not slept at all. He sat beside Ranger near the fire, carefully tightening the splint around the German Shepherd's injured hind leg. The dog remained unnaturally calm despite the pain. His deep brown eyes followed Cade constantly now, as though worried more about the man than himself. You should rest, Mara Ellison whispered softly. She crouched beside them, holding steaming water wrapped in cloth. Dark circles shadowed her pale freckled face, and loose auburn strands clung to damp skin near her temples. Even exhausted, she still moved with quiet steadiness, helping survivors, checking temperatures, calming frightened children. Cade shook his head. Later. That's what you said yesterday. Yesterday wasn't enough. Before Mara could answer, frantic pounding exploded against the outer support wall. Everyone in the cabin jolted awake. Walter Boone reached for his rifle automatically, while Sheriff Owen Pike shoved open the reinforced side hatch against screaming wind. A young man stumbled inside, half frozen. Tyler Reed. 22 years old, skinny beneath oversized winter layers, dark hair plastered across his forehead with melting snow. Tyler worked maintenance at Pine Hollow's small community station, though most people still saw him as the reckless mechanic kid who rebuilt snowmobiles for fun behind his uncle's garage, and right now he looked terrified. "The station lost heat completely," he gasped. "Generator died an hour ago." The cabin fell silent. Tyler's lips trembled violently as he continued. "There are kids there, elderly people too. They're freezing." Cade stood instantly. "How many? Maybe 30? Walter swore quietly beneath his breath. Owen closed his eyes briefly, shame flickering across his exhausted face. "I should have evacuated them sooner." "No time for that now," Cade replied sharply. The storm shook the warm ring walls hard enough to rattle hanging lanterns. Outside, whiteout conditions had become nearly impossible. Visibility barely stretched beyond the guide ropes now, yet Cade's mind already moved ahead automatically. Supplies, routes, heat, transport, survival. He turned toward the room. "We moved dry wood first, then blankets, then emergency heaters." Tyler stared around the warm ring structure with dawning realization. "This whole thing," he whispered. "You built it for this?" Cade met his eyes. "I built it because winter doesn't forgive mistakes." Within 20 minutes, the cabin transformed into a command center. People who had mocked Cade days earlier now waited for instructions without hesitation. The warm ring became the spine holding Pine Hollow Bend together. Walter Boone coordinated sled loading beside the protected dry wood racks, and despite his age, the old hunter moved through the snow with stubborn mountain strength, barking orders while hauling timber bundles onto rescue sleds. Jacob Mercer organized repair crews for collapsing roofs. Mara handled warming stations and medical checks inside the cabin corridors. And Sheriff Owen Pike finally stopped pretending the system had everything under control. The sheriff stood before the gathered volunteers near the outer rescue ropes, snow whipping violently across his coat. His voice shook slightly. "People trusted me to protect this town," he said quietly, "and I kept telling everyone this storm would pass." Nobody interrupted. Owen looked toward Cade. I was wrong." The words seemed to cost him something real. "I should have listened sooner." Silence followed. Then Walter Boone stepped forward slowly. The old hunter's weathered face looked carved from frozen wood beneath lantern glow. "I've seen a winter kill people before," Walter said. "Back in '83. Wind screamed across the beams outside. Walter pointed toward the warm ring. "But Cade Whitmore is the only man up here who prepared for this one." The room remained still afterward. Not because people felt guilty, because they understood now. This had never been paranoia, never madness, never a fortress. It was survival. From near the stove, Noah Bell suddenly spoke up. The 10-year-old sat wrapped in blankets beside Ranger, sketchbook resting across his knees. They're not walls," he murmured. Everyone looked at him. Noah pointed toward the warm ring beams surrounding the cabin. "They're warm walls." The phrase lingered quietly in the room. Then Tyler Reed nodded slowly. "Warm walls," he repeated. And somehow the name spread immediately after that. Not because it sounded clever, because people needed something to believe in. Hours later, while rescue teams prepared to leave for the community station, Ranger suddenly struggled painfully to his feet. Cade moved immediately. "Easy," but the dog ignored him. Despite the splinted leg, Ranger limped toward the outer storm hatch and stopped there rigidly, listening. The wind outside screamed violently through the whiteout. Then Ranger barked once, sharp, focused, and for one impossible moment, the storm shifted just enough for sunlight to break faintly through the clouds above the northern ridge. Only a few seconds. Just long enough for the entire town to see the warm walls glowing gold beneath the snow. Then the light vanished again, but nobody forgot it. The final rescue convoy departed shortly afterward. 3 sled teams, 2 repair crews, 1 lifeline route, and 1 injured German shepherd leading all of them. Cade hated allowing Ranger outside injured. Ranger hated staying behind even more. The dog moved at the front of the main rescue sled, limping but relentless. His ears constantly tracked wind shifts, while his sharp barks warned the teams whenever drifts became unstable or visibility collapsed entirely. Without him, they would have walked straight into snowbanks twice already. Whiteout conditions worsened near the lower valley. Snow erased depth perception completely until sky and ground became one endless moving sheet of white. Guide ropes remained the only thing separating rescue teams from disappearing forever into the storm. Tyler Reed stumbled hard once beside the sled line. "I can't see anything." "Keep one hand on the rope," Cade shouted over the wind, "and never let go." Ahead, Ranger barked twice sharply and veered left. Cade trusted him instantly. Seconds later, a massive drift collapsed where the team would have walked otherwise. Nobody spoke afterward. Fear had become too real now. When they finally reached the community station, the situation looked worse than anyone imagined. Ice coated the inside windows. Families huddled beneath blankets in darkness. Children cried weakly beside dead heaters. Several elderly residents already showed signs of severe hypothermia. One of them, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, looked close to unconsciousness when Cade entered carrying the first load of dry wood. Evelyn was nearly 80, once the town librarian before arthritis slowly stole movement from her hands. Even now, wrapped in quilts beside dying lantern light, she still carried the gentle posture of someone who spent her life protecting stories. Her lips trembled weakly. "We thought nobody was coming." Cade knelt beside the frozen stove. "You're getting heat now." Within minutes, dry wood burned, heaters restarted, blankets spread, emergency soup boiled. Warmth slowly returned to the station. So did hope. Outside, repair crews reinforced roofs using Cade's support methods, while Owen coordinated evacuations towards safer structures. And everywhere the same realization spread quietly through Pine Hollow Bend. Preparation had saved them. Not luck. Not forecasts. Preparation. Near evening, the storm reached its worst point yet. Wind howled so violently, entire trees bent sideways across the ridge. The final evacuation group became stranded halfway between the station and the warm walls after guide markers vanished beneath fresh drifts. Panic spread instantly. Visibility dropped to almost zero. Then Ranger barked. Once, twice, 3 times. The injured German shepherd stood against the storm facing into the wind, nose lifted slightly, listening, sensing. He began moving carefully forward through whiteout conditions no human could navigate alone. The rescue sled teams followed. Cade stayed directly behind him, gripping the rope line tightly. Every few feet, Rangers stopped briefly, adjusting direction based on changing wind currents before continuing again. The entire town moved through frozen blindness, following one wounded dog. And somehow, it worked. Hours later, the final survivors crossed into the warm walls shelter alive. The cabin erupted into exhausted relief. People cried openly, and children hugged each other beside lantern heat. Walter Boone simply sat heavily against the wall, staring into the fire with tears frozen inside his beard. Sheriff Owen looked toward Cade across the crowded shelter. "You saved this town." Cade shook his head slowly. No. He looked down at Ranger resting beside the stove. We all did. Outside, the blizzard still raged across Pine Hollow Bend. But inside the warm walls, an entire town remained alive because one man had prepared for a winter nobody else believed could come. And because one loyal dog refused to stop leading people home. The storm ended the way wounded animals sometimes leave the forest. Slowly, reluctantly, and only after taking pieces of everything with it. 3 days after the final whiteout, sunlight finally broke across Pine Hollow Bend. Golden light spilled over the valley in long trembling beams, revealing a world transformed beneath mountains of snow and silence. The destruction stretched everywhere. Cabin roofs sagged inward beneath frozen weight. Pine trees lay shattered across roads like broken bones. The lake had become a solid white sheet reaching endlessly beneath the pale sky. Fences vanished beneath drifts taller than trucks. But smoke rose from chimneys, voices echoed through the valley, and children laughed again. And every single person in Pine Hollow Bend was alive. Cade Whitmore stood outside his cabin, staring across the ridge with Ranger resting beside him. The German shepherd's injured hind leg still carried a slight limp, but the splint was gone now. His thick black and tan coat shone beneath winter sunlight, while cold air curled from his nose in soft clouds. For the first time in days, Ranger looked calm, truly calm. Cade envied him for that. The wind brushed gently through the pines surrounding the warm walls, carrying sounds of rebuilding from down in town. Hammer strikes, chainsaws, distant laughter, voices calling to one another through snow. Life returning. And Walter Boone climbed slowly up the ridge, carrying a stack of leather-bound journals beneath one arm. The old hunter looked smaller after the storm somehow, like the mountain had shaved years directly from his body. But his pale eyes remained sharp beneath heavy gray brows. "You standing there brooding again?" Walter asked dryly. Cade huffed a faint laugh. "Maybe." Walter handed him the journals. The covers looked ancient, cracked by cold and time. "What are these?" "My father's weather logs, and his father's before him." Cade opened the first notebook carefully, and inside were handwritten records stretching back nearly 80 years. Snowfall depths, avalanche paths, temperature collapses, storms that killed livestock and trapped families for weeks. Walter stared across the valley quietly. "Every generation up here thought winter changed," he murmured. "Truth is, people just forget how dangerous it always was." Cade ran his thumb slowly across one of the pages. Then Walter added softly, "Until somebody reminds them." Neither man spoke after that. They didn't need to. Below them, Pine Hollow Bend was already rebuilding itself differently than before. Because now the town remembered. Over the following weeks, the warm walls spread across the valley, and not out of fear, out of understanding. Earl Maddox arrived at Cade's cabin every morning before sunrise, carrying lumber over one broad shoulder. The once loud-mouthed dock worker had changed after the storm. Some humility had settled into him now, quieting the arrogance he used to wear like armor. One morning he knelt beside the damaged wooden dock near Cade's cabin, tightening support bolts against fresh timber beams. "You know," Earl muttered while working, "I spent 2 weeks calling you crazy." Cade sanded one of the warm wall braces nearby. "You weren't the only one." "Still." Earl glanced toward Ranger lying in sunlight nearby. "That dog brought my little girl home." Emotion thickened his rough voice unexpectedly. "So I figure fixing your dock for free still leaves me owing both of you." Cade looked at him for a long moment before finally nodding once. That was enough. Men like them understood silence better than speeches. Farther down the valley, Sheriff Owen Pike personally oversaw construction of Pine Hollow Bend's first permanent public winter shelter. The sheriff no longer carried himself with stiff authority alone. The storm had humbled him in ways no election or badge ever could. Now he listened more than he spoke. The shelter stood beside the community station, reinforced with angled snow-shedding roofs, emergency dry wood storage, buried heat pipes, whiteout guide ropes, insulated sleeping corridors, all based on Cade's designs. People stopped calling them strange structures now. Everyone simply called them warm walls. One afternoon near the end of winter, Cade found rangers sitting alone beside the northern ridge overlooking the valley. The dog wasn't moving, wasn't watching wildlife, wasn't listening for danger. He simply stared toward the distant mountain pass where the storm first appeared weeks ago. Cade walked beside him slowly. "You still hear it sometimes too?" Ranger glanced up briefly, then lowered his head against Cade's boot. At that exact moment, wind moved softly through the pine trees surrounding the ridge. And for the briefest second, Cade could have sworn he heard Eli Mercer laughing somewhere far behind him in the forest. Not painful, not haunting, peaceful, like an old promise finally set down. Spring arrived late but stubbornly. Snow slowly retreated from the valley floor while dark earth emerged beneath dripping pines. Streams reopened beneath melting ice. Birds returned cautiously to the forest. And Pine Hollow Bend celebrated survival, the only way small mountain towns knew how. Together. The Spring Thaw Festival took place beneath strings of lanterns hung across the town square. Long wooden tables stretched between snowbanks while families carried food from every surviving kitchen in town. Music drifted softly through cold evening air. Children chased each other between fire pits. And for the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow Bend, Cade didn't stand apart from it all. He stood inside it. Mara Ellison handed him a steaming cup near one of the bonfires. "You know," she said softly, "people smile when they say your name now." Cade glanced around awkwardly. That still feels strange. Mara smiled faintly. Mara was beautiful in the quiet way mountain towns often shaped people. Auburn hair loose around her shoulders, pale freckled skin touched by spring light, calm green eyes that noticed more than they judged. "You saved them," she said. "We saved each other. That's probably why they trust you." Nearby, Ranger rested beneath one of the tables, while children slipped scraps of meat to him, despite repeated warnings from parents. The dog accepted every offering with patient dignity. Noah Bell approached quietly through the crowd, carrying something large wrapped beneath his coat. The boy looked nervous. His dark curls bounced slightly beneath a wool cap too large for his head, while his sketchbook poked visibly from his coat pocket. "Mr. Whitmore?" Cade crouched slightly. "Hey, Noah. I made something." Noah carefully unfolded a large painting. The valley appeared across the canvas beneath snowfall and darkness. At the center stood Cade and Ranger, beside glowing warm walls stretching across Pine Hollow Bend. Every home showed golden firelight. Every path remained connected through guide ropes. No house stood alone in the storm anymore. At the bottom, written carefully in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Now nobody has to freeze alone anymore." Cade stared at the painting without speaking. Around him, festival sounds faded slowly into distant echoes. His throat tightened painfully, because suddenly he wasn't seeing paint. And he was seeing Eli Mercer freezing in snow, broken shelters overseas, promises made beside dying fires. Every sleepless year afterward, every mile wandered trying to outrun guilt. And now, this valley, these people, these lights. Warmth spread through Pine Hollow Bend, because he kept a promise nobody else even remembered. Tears blurred his vision suddenly. Cade lowered his head sharply, trying unsuccessfully to hide it, but Noah simply smiled. "It's okay," the boy whispered gently. "My mom cries during happy movies too." A rough laugh escaped Cade at the exact same moment tears finally fell. Not from grief, not from trauma. Relief. The kind that comes only after carrying pain too long alone. Ranger rose quietly and pressed against Cade's side. Steady, faithful, home. Late that spring, long after the festival ended, Cade woke suddenly in darkness. Pure instinct. The same reflex that had dragged him awake countless nights since the war. For one disoriented moment, panic tightened his chest. He listened. Wind moved softly outside the cabin. Nothing else. No screaming. No collapsing shelters. No storm. And Cade rose slowly and stepped onto the porch. Cold spring air drifted through the pine forest, carrying wood smoke and distant laughter from the valley below. And there they were. Warm lights. Dozens of them. New warm walls glowed gently across Pine Hollow Bend beneath the stars. Chimney smoke curled peacefully into the night sky while lanterns flickered beside homes, prepared for whatever winter might someday return. Ranger stepped beside him and lay down calmly against his boots. No alarms, no fear, just peace. Cade looked across the valley for a long time, and then finally, after years spent surviving instead of living, he understood something simple and beautiful. He was no longer standing watch over winter alone. And for the first time since leaving the war behind, Cade Whitmore felt home settle quietly into his heart like the final snowfall of a long season finally ending. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive as flashes of light or voices from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the form of a loyal dog that refuses to leave your side, a stranger who chooses to help instead of walk away, or a broken man who keeps one promise long enough to save an entire town. Cade Whitmore believed he was only building walls against winter. But perhaps God had been building something else inside him all along. A way back to hope, back to people, back to life itself. And maybe that is how God often works in our lives too. Not always by removing the storm, but by placing the right souls beside us while we walk through it. And there are people today carrying silent winters inside their hearts. Grief, loneliness, fear, memories they cannot escape. Sometimes all it takes to save a life is warmth, a phone call, a kind word, a hand reaching back before someone disappears into the cold. So if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, because every light matters in this world more than we realize. And if you believe stories about loyalty, healing, faith, and second chances still matter, subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories and walk this journey with us. And may God bless your home with the warmth, protect the people you love, calm every storm you are fighting in silence, and remind you that no winter lasts forever.